Testing the microphone. It is this loud and this echoey. Welcome everyone, it's 9 o'clock and I'm going to wait until 9:01 to start talking because people typically float in a little after 9. All right, welcome everybody back to my Sunday morning class. Today is week 3 about the topic of God's eternal plan. I'm going to open with prayer because I need it. God, we're here again to study your word, and God, again, I pray that you would help me to unpack it correctly. We are people in need of instruction and prone to error, and I just pray that by your grace, through your word and through your spirit, we would receive both those things here. I pray that our study of your word would bring illumination to us and glory to you. Amen. So, weeks 1 and 2, we talked about the idea of eternity, and then we talked about the fall. I talked about what I think is the biblical idea of eternity, and no one spoke up to disagree with me, so it appears that we have some unity of opinion there. And the idea of eternity is that God created not only the physical substance of the universe, but also time itself. Time does not go back infinitely, but time has a beginning point when God makes it, where God himself stands outside of time, sees the beginning, sees the future, sees all that will happen. And therefore, all that happens in our universe is known by God beforehand, is seen by God, is planned for by God. Nothing is catching him by surprise. Hence God's eternal plan. When God creates the universe, creates it in its good and perfect state and says it's very good, God is already completely aware of the fall, of the crucifixion, of the resurrection, of all these things that will happen, as his plan is eternal. Week 2 we talked about the fall and the nature of evil. Like, what exactly is it that happens when Adam and Eve decide to eat this fruit, when they decide to deviate from God's plan? And I talked about the idea that there is a distinction between punishments and consequences. Paul says in the book of Romans that the wages of sin is death. Not that the punishment for sin is death, but the wages. And what are wages? Wages are what we get automatically, naturally, as a result of our having done something. And this death that Adam and Eve suffer, which is, of course, a separation from God, is an immediate effect of their sin. It's not something that God decides to arbitrarily inflict because he's a mean guy and is mad that he was crossed. Their separation from him is an immediate consequence of their choosing to step outside of his plan. And I said I think we see that when in Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve sin, they immediately realize they are naked, which means that they immediately understand that they are in danger. They immediately feel alienated from each other and alienated from the creation. And that happens before God pronounces any punishments upon them. So this week, in the lesson plan, what I'm going to talk about is quite a bit different from what was in the lesson plan, because it sort of breezed right through everything from Cain and Abel through Joseph, all in one lesson. which seemed to me like it was going at kind of a breakneck speed and also covering a lot of stuff that people probably are already familiar with. We already are quite familiar with the story of Joseph and Abraham. So I wanted to linger a little bit more at the beginning of that section and talk about, well, mostly about Noah and the flood, because I think that really illuminates this problem, the problem of evil, and why God needs to do something about it. What is God going to do about evil? So Adam and Eve have sinned. Their death has occurred. They are now separated from God. They are now outside of his plans. Okay. Is that really that big of a deal? Do we need to do something about that? So I don't remember who. Someone brought up last week, interesting fact that in both the Greek and the Hebrew, the word in Greek is pronounced hamartia, something similar to that anyway, and the word in Hebrew is something that I wasn't going to try to pronounce because it sounds like I'm trying to talk Klingon if I try to pronounce Hebrew words. But according to my brief research, both the word in Greek and Hebrew that we translate in our Bibles as sin actually refers to missing a target. Specifically the word is used in archery, when you shoot an arrow at a target and that arrow goes somewhere other than at the target. So when people become evil, they are now no longer aligned with the goal, the agenda, the overall plan that God has set in motion in the creation. They are now aligned with their own plans that they're making up themselves that are not in harmony with anything. And that leads to two effects. One I already mentioned is death, which death in this biblical sense is not meaning the physical death of the body, but this separation from God, a divorce from God. And the other thing that is a consequence of missing the mark is futility, which I think is a very important concept. I'm going to read from Romans 8:20 again. With either scripture passages, if someone else happens to get there first and wants to start talking, go ahead. Romans 8, starting in verse 19, Paul says, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it." So here and elsewhere in Scripture also, this idea pops up that as a result of evil, as a result of sin, not only people, but all of creation have become futile. What is futility? Futility is when our actions have no purpose. Last week I used the analogy of cancer in the body and said every cell in the body has a purpose. They're all united in their great diversity. They're united in upholding and producing the body so that it can function and do all the things that the body does. Whereas a cancer cell is not united. A cancer cell has missed the mark and is now going its own way, and its actions are therefore futile. Its actions do not contribute to the functioning of the body, and they don't even ultimately contribute to the cancer's own flourishing, because at the end of cancer comes physical death, in which the cancer itself also dies. Completely pointless, reckless division of cells that accomplishes nothing. And this is futility. And this is what was introduced into the creation, introduced into humanity when people sinned. So that's the situation now. Yes?
Is there, either in our minds or in God's mind, a difference between evil and sin?
Question, is there a difference between evil and sin?
Is it a matter of degrees?
I'm going to say that sin is the evil stuff that I do. When I think the term evil encompasses both my sin and also the effects of the sin. That's my thinking about it. Sin is my evil actions. Evil is both that and also the result in the world of it. And of course, words are words. Definitions aren't always precise. That's how I'm thinking about it here. So this is the condition that people are now in. They are separated from God. and their actions have now become futile. So, question is, well, can't God just ignore that? What's the big deal? And I see that attitude a lot in our culture, where there are various things that people want to do that are popular things. In our culture, it's generally sexual things that people want to do because they think it's going to be fun or fulfilling, and God says, no, don't do that. God has defined the appropriate limits of sexuality very narrowly in marriage. And, well, people don't like that. People want to do other things that they think are more fun, and they feel like God is just being a big, mean bully, and how is it his business anyway, what I do with my body? So the question is, why does God need to do anything about sin, or about evil? Why can't God just let people do their thing and let it go? So I thought it would be useful to examine in the Bible, and of course there are all sorts of examples in real life. If you want to go and examine history and see what evil looks like in human experience, people have done lots of evil, and we can really see that. But I was wanting to look in Scripture and kind of get a picture of what does evil look like? How does this problem of separation from God and futility actually manifest? So I'm looking here at evil prior to the flood. Why prior to the flood? Well, because that's when God really stepped in to do something about it in a really big, dramatic way. Aside from the incarnation, God becoming flesh in Jesus, aside from that, the biggest, most dramatic thing God ever did about evil was sending a flood to wipe it out. Why was that necessary? So I'm looking here at a couple of examples that are actually from in Scripture occur before the flood. And I'm also going to throw Sodom in there, because Sodom is another example when God took direct action to wipe out some evil that he thought was too bad to be there. So I'm choosing to lump Sodom and Gomorrah into a sort of a pre-flood sort of evil, because God took the same action against it. So when people are evil, what does that end up looking like? We know that when people are good, let me ask you this. Imagine you are living in a world where people are good. You are out wandering, let's say in the desert. Your car is broken down and you are alone and you are hoping for some way to survive. But you live in a world where people are good and you see a figure on the horizon. How do you feel about that? There's a person over there. I'm going to go to them because people are good, and I know that a person, therefore, is a sign of assistance, is a sign of help. A person is something that I can join up with, and we can help each other, and things are going to be great because I found a person. If you're living in a world where people are evil, and you're out wandering in the desert and see that figure on the horizon, what do you think? Uh-oh, now I'm in more trouble, because I know that that person has the potential to be more dangerous to me than anything in nature could be. And you look at the way people interact with the world, and
you may need to talk a little louder.
I need to talk louder? Okay. Can the mic be a little bit louder, or can I just shout?
It's out the mic is turned up as high.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay.
So you want me to shout at you?
Pretty much.
Okay, I'm going to shout. All right. Thanks for that. I appreciate that. See, I always told I've taught at community colleges, and I would always tell my students on the first day, I might start talking too fast, and if I do that, just like say, slow down. So appreciate the feedback. So humanity, by the nature of our intelligence, of the way we are constructed, nature presents some sort of a threat to us, but we are able to tame nature. We are able by our intelligence to control and harness nature, and if we have a little bit of time to work on things, nature really ceases to be a threat to us. Even things like disease, we have a large amount of ability to control and to conquer. To the point where, people nowadays today, it's like we all pretty much assume we're going to live into our 70s or 80s and nothing's going to hurt us because we have controlled nature. what is the real threat to humans? What is the threat that we worry about? Are we worried about lions and tigers and bears? What concerns us? Well, we're concerned that, well, maybe an atom bomb will drop out of the sky and vaporize our city. That's something people worry about. We're worried about that somebody on the street might pull out a gun or a knife and want to mug us. That's the thing we worry about. And we worry about people we trust might betray us. So those are the things that are actually threats to humans on Earth, much more so than anything in nature could be. And that is because of evil. We'll look at Genesis 8:13. Genesis 3:8 through 13. This is immediately after God has confronted Adam and Eve for their sin. And so we're not told what the relationship between Adam and Eve is previous to this, because this happens pretty much right at the beginning. But I'm going to assume that Adam and Eve had a positive, affirming relationship prior to this, because there was simply, God created them to be in complete compatibility and harmony with each other. God created everything good, and there was no reason for Adam and Eve to be in conflict with each other. However, as soon as they sin, what's the very first thing that happens between them?
Hid themselves from each other.
Okay, that's even before I was going to go with, but that's right, Chuck. They hid themselves from each other. Why do people hide themselves from each other? Because they recognize the danger. They what? Bind? Blame. There we go. Yes, that's what I was going for. They blame each other. Verse 12, God has confronted Adam about his sin and said, Adam, what's going on? He gives Adam a chance to own up. The man said, the woman whom you gave me to be with, she gave me the fruit and I ate. So immediately Adam, instead of being in cooperative, nourishing harmony with Eve because of evil in the world, because of Adam's own sin, he is immediately in conflict with her. Why? Because they now have divergent interests. Prior to evil, Adam and Eve have completely compatible, harmonized interests. Everything that is good for Adam is also good for Eve. Everything that is good for Eve is also good for Adam. But now they are evil. Now there is sin, and so now their interests have split. And what is good for Adam is no longer good for Eve, because now what is good for Adam is to blame somebody else. So, first view of what an evil world looks like is people now have incompatible interests. People are now in competition instead of in harmony. And what is good for one is not what is good for another. We'll skip ahead now to Genesis 4, 3 through 8. This is the famous story of Cain and Abel. Can't really tell from the Bible, either possibly the first two children of Adam and Eve, but at any rate, brothers, Adam and Eve's direct offspring. I'm just going to read the story. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering God had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So here we have the first instance in the Bible of envy. What is envy? Envy is what I see what you have, and instead of me feeling happy for you that you have a good thing, I feel angry that it's not my good thing. In this account, does God punish Cain prior to his attack on Abel? God doesn't accept his offering. We're not told why. It doesn't really matter why. In this case, God's acceptance of the offering is a good thing that Abel has, and Cain doesn't have it. And Cain has not been punished. God has not rebuked Cain. God has not inflicted any sort of punishment upon Cain for his bad offering. God just didn't take it. Cain is angry. God says to Cain, "If you do well, will you not be accepted?" So Cain, for whatever reason, is deficient. He hasn't measured up to what God wants. And what is God's response to that? God tells Cain, well, you can do better, and then you'll be accepted. But that's not what Cain does, is it? Cain does not take this opportunity for self-improvement to bring himself up to God's standard. Instead, he looks with envy upon the one who has what he wants and decides, I'm going to bring him down instead. And I want to point out the irrationality of that. And envy is, if you analyze it and boil down what's actually happening, I would say that all evil is actually irrational. All evil is ultimately stupid if you think about it enough. But envy is especially stupid. Envy is especially irrational because envy does not help the envious person. If you have something that I like, my being angry with you about it does not help me get it. What helps me to get what I want is to look at the person who has better and be inspired by them and improve myself so that I can be better and have it too, which is exactly what God tells Cain to do here. Yeah?
Evil has one rule: win.
Evil has one rule: win.
That's it.
Yes.
That's it. If logic is a tool to win, use it. If murder is a tool to win, use it. Mm-hmm. That's what evil and chaos does.
Yes. Yeah, Paul points out that evil will use reason to the end of fulfilling itself, of enriching itself. But if logic doesn't seem like it's going to enrich me, then forget it. Very true. But here with Cain and Abel, we see this pattern of envy that is repeated throughout human history, throughout our own experience. And that is the pattern of using vandalism to enhance myself. What is vandalism? Vandalism is when I take what someone else has made, the good thing someone else has made, and I destroy it. Because by destroying what you made, it makes me feel like I am above you. And this takes many forms. I think often bullying is a form of vandalism where I'm trying to commit vandalism against a person. Here's a person, which is a good thing. I'm going to break that person down, tear them down, because by doing so, if they come down, well, now I'm higher than they are by comparison. And that's where envy leads us. Envy leads us to a place where we are seeking not to build ourselves up to be better, but to tear other people down so that we seem better by comparison to them. Don't rise to the bar, lower the bar. And that's what Cain does. And his means of lowering that bar is we'll just get rid of the person who passes over it. Get rid of the person who's better than me, then I'm the best. How else does evil look prior to the flood? This guy Lamech, who was actually Noah's father, is briefly mentioned. He's very briefly mentioned here in a quotation that he says. Lamech takes 2 wives. Verse 23 of Genesis 4. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So what is Lamech saying here? Lamech says, if anybody crosses me, if anybody hurts me, I'm going to hurt them back so much worse. My vengeance is 77-fold. If someone strikes me, someone hurts me, I'm going to kill them. So what Lamech is doing here is he is prioritizing his own interests far above anybody else's. What is good for Lamech is way more important than what is good for anyone else. Lamech first, anyone crosses Lamech, they're dead, because he's looking out for number one. And he doesn't just do this. What I think is interesting here is that Lamech doesn't just do this like sort of on a random basis. He's not just behaving savagely. He's got this little poetic formula to justify why it's okay for him to do this. He has done some philosophizing. He's made up a little intellectual system to justify putting himself first in all things. Note here about him having 2 wives. I don't want to talk about the morality of polygamy, but let's talk about the logistics of polygamy. God makes one man and one woman, and when people are born into the world, they come out as in a 1-to-1 ratio. There's one man for every one woman, and that's how we're made. So, if one man has 2 wives, what must have happened? There are 2 options. One, he has taken an additional wife and deprived some other man of having one, or 2, that other man is dead. And there are now too many women for each to have the 1-to-1 ratio. So I'm going to, logistically, polygamy is only workable in a context where there is violence. Polygamy is only works in a context where men are either taking from each other what rightfully shouldn't be theirs, or they're killing each other so that there aren't enough men to go around. And if Lamech's to be taken at his word here that he's killing people who wound him, I think we can guess it's that other option. That we now have a world here that is full of violence, where people are killing each other, and they're therefore making systems to accommodate their evil and accommodate their violence. Yeah?
Another side of that idea, rather than saying there's a 1-to-1 ratio of men and women,
Yeah, Powell points out that Lamech is demonstrating greed here. He is taking more than what God has planned, more than what God has designed, which is, of course, what we're talking about with evil, where people, instead of going with the goal, the system that God has set up, they try and make up their own. And Lamech's system that he's made up for himself here is one of greed and self-glorification, where he can take what he wants and destroy what he wants because he is the most important. And we don't get a lot of information specifically about what happens before the flood, but we got this. And so I'm going to take that as sort of an archetype for how people were behaving then. That's how things were. And we definitely see that in our world today, where people are greedy. Their desires are not limited by reason, by a sense of appropriateness, and their actions toward others are not moderated by respect. And that's what we see here with Lamech. Genesis 19, which again is not, Genesis 19, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, occurs after the flood. But I'm discussing it here because, as with the pre-flood world, God destroyed it directly. So I think they can be lumped together and used for the same example. Sodom is an evil place. And I think we misuse the term sodomy because we make it too specific, whereas the evil in Sodom is actually a whole lot broader than any specific perversions. They're doing a lot. Sodom is a generally evil place. There's not any specific thing going on there that's the one bad thing. And it's demonstrated when the angels God sends go in there to scope the place out. I'm reading from Genesis 19 here. Starting in verse 1. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night there and wash your feet. Then you may rise up and go early on your way." They said, "No, we'll spend the night in the town square." But Lot pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So, two strangers walk into Sodom. And immediately, Lot sees them, and he's like, "You need to come to my house right now and leave as soon as possible, and do not stay in a public place." Why? Well, we see why in the next, I'm not going to read all of it, I'm sure you're familiar with the story. But Lot takes the two strangers into his house, and as soon as darkness falls, a massive gang forms around the house of men who want to sexually assault the two guests. And not only do they want to do that, they are also so vehement about their desire to do this that they are going to assault Lot. They're going to break into his house and take what they want. And Lot apparently, I'm like, "Well, Lot, why do you live there?" It's like, Lot, if you know that's what your neighbors are like, why are you there? What are you doing?
That's the question, isn't it? Why doesn't he take his own advice?
Well, I think the answer is money. Because somehow Lot was making money in Sodom. He was getting wealthy, and so he was just putting up with this. Mistake. Don't do that.
I think he lost all his money by going to Lot, because he had big flocks and everything to start with, but eventually I don't think he had much at all.
Yeah, Lot eventually becomes destitute as a result of his bad associates. So, Sodom, evil city. What's it like there? Well, like I mentioned before, if you live in a place where people are evil and you see a figure on the horizon, do you feel comforted? No, you feel afraid. And Sodom is a place where all the people need to feel in fear, because the people who live there are not there to help them, are not there to, do not appreciate them, do not respect them. The people in Sodom are there to prey upon them. The people in Sodom are predatory, and they are interested only in taking whatever. So the men, it says, who surround Lot's house are there to rape the strangers. I think it's very safe to assume they were also interested in robbing the strangers, probably killing the strangers. They're there to take from these two strangers whatever there is to be taken. If there's any way to exploit these guys, that's why they're there. They're going to do it, and they're going to take whatever value exists. So the people of Sodom are predatory. And when people are evil, that's the state they come into, where people are no longer friends, people are no longer neighbors, people are no longer partners in building good things. People become predators of people, where they are only interested in taking from each other. And that's the state we see in Sodom, and the state God deems worthy of destruction. I'm going to skip Galatians 5:19. It's Paul's list of the works of the flesh, which is the opposite counterpart to the fruits of the Spirit. And Paul just lists off a bunch of bad stuff. Yeah?
Just real quick, one of the things I think is interesting is you go down the list, those
Scott says that this is a process. People become more and more evil over time. You move from the divergence of interest we see with Adam and Eve to eventually people being just completely predatory and viewing each other merely as a resource to be exploited. which actually was my, good job, actually was my next point. So an evil world is one of violence, exploitation, and futility, where you can't trust anybody, you have to be afraid all the time, and everything you do is futile, leading to no good ends, which again, I'm going to say that's very like what cancer does in the body. And of course, the destruction of the body by cancer is also a process where the cancer invades different organs over time and eventually leads to the total death.
God said that as much clearly in Genesis chapter 6 when he said, every thought of mankind is evil continually.
Yes, sir. Genesis chapter 6. So that's what evil world looks like. And then in, where is it at?
Lot's no saint either.
Oh no, lots of bad, lots of nasty dudes.
Giving up his daughters. Well, here, take them.
Okay, I wasn't going to mention that, but yeah, you point out correctly. Yeah, so Lot himself being a man of Sodom. Yeah. So Lot in that story.
Anyway.
That's detail I missed. Lot does send out his offer up his own daughters as a sacrifice to the evil men surrounding the house in that story. So again, Lot behaving selfishly but cowardly, using his daughters as a resource to help him, not as something to be treasured. Genesis 6, chapter 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So, that's what an evil world is like. Before the flood, that's what everybody's like. The Bible says that every person, every intention, every heart, only evil all the time. What does the world look like? We now have a world that instead of being a world full of nurturing, fruitful communities of people who love each other, who are supporting each other, who are doing good and seeking each other's good and seeking to please God, we have a world that is all full of people who are these vicious predators who are only looking to exploit each other all the time. And it looks like Noah is the only dude left who is not like that. So prior to the flood, the earth has come to a place, and it's been sent from Adam to the flood as a period of approximately 1,700 years. From between, don't need to elaborate more than that. But there's been a lot of time for civilization to progress and develop. Little aside, it always irritates me when I see pictures of Noah and people before the flood. They're always depicted as wearing traditional Middle Eastern garb, which seems silly. And Noah always has a big white beard, as if he was like this super old man, which doesn't really make sense to me because we know Noah lived 800 years? People back then were living for hundreds of years, and Noah is actually middle-aged according to his own biology. So why does Noah look like this ancient dude? It's like, I picture Noah as, looking kind of like this. I figure Noah is probably middle-aged from his own perspective. And who knows what he's wearing? Probably not the robes and turbans of contemporary Middle Easterners or traditional Middle Easterners. It would have been a distinct civilization about which we really know nothing except that it was evil, but it would have been its own thing, not just similar to what Moses would have known. So this is the state of the entire world. So back to my original question. Why does God need to do something about evil? Why can't God just ignore it? Why can't God just say, you know what? You people want to do some sin. I'm just going to turn a blind eye to that. I'm just going to, be gracious, and y'all do what you want, and we'll just be friends. What? I think if we study what evil actually does and looks like, it's obvious that God doesn't really have that option. God cannot just ignore evil, because if you ignore evil, what happens? It covers the planet. It metastasizes. It takes over everything. And after evil has taken over everything, it consumes and destroys itself, because evil is futile. So God, after man sins, basically he's got, in my estimation, two options. God can ignore evil whatever, do what you want, it's all good. If God does that, what happens? If God ignores evil, the world is consumed by evil, and humanity horribly devours itself, and that's the end of things. Or God can fix evil. God can do something about it. And God chooses to do something about it. And that's the rest of the Bible. But I think it's really important to realize that this is not an arbitrary choice by God. This is not God simply having some arbitrary preferences that he likes and being angry that people aren't doing it. This is God in his infinite wisdom, with his infinite perspective, recognizing the absolute devastation that will come if he doesn't do something about this. Yeah.
We're reading this, and the Romans writer says that what was written aforetime was written for our learning. There's something that's being demonstrated that the world without God's creation, he said it's good. But when I ignore God's creation and I inject my own chaos, my own sin, my own whatever, and that multiplies, that goes to seed, so to speak. That we're being told here that a life, a world without God, I like your term, destroys itself. Has no vision, has no direction, except destroying itself. Evil destroys.
Evil destroys, yes. Ultimately, if you let evil go off on its own, the end result for the evil people is not that they have a good time doing their own thing. The result is that they are destroyed by their own wickedness, by their own futility. Oops, too far. So, what is God going to do about evil? We see in Genesis basically two steps God takes. The first is the flood. And the flood is where God kills everybody. And that seems like this horrible act of judgment, which it is. But if you think about it, it's also an act of mercy. Because what if God does not wipe out the evil? We've already reached a state where everyone is evil. Evil has dominated the world. And except for Noah, the only good guy, except for him, humanity is on the verge of completely collapsing into this awful state from which there will be, how do you come back from that? How do you come back from a state where there's no one you can talk to, there's no one I can talk to for good advice, because everyone is evil. There's no one who's listening to God, because everyone is evil. How does humanity come back from a state where everyone is this selfish, vicious, foolish, predatory person? How do you get back from that? You don't. So when God kills everybody in the flood, what God is doing is giving humanity a second chance. Humanity is about to be completely consumed by evil, and God says, I'm going to give you another shot at this. Takes Noah, saves him, and gives humanity a chance to start over again and do better. And I think if you think about it that way, the flood is actually a mercy. God is having mercy on humanity by giving them a second chance that they don't deserve. I never thought about it that way until I was reading this. And it's, like I said, I've really enjoyed teaching these classes because it's led me to think about stuff that I hadn't considered before, and that's one of those things. So first thing God does about evil, the flood, wipes the slate clean, gives people a new chance to start over and do better, and hopefully not be completely dominated by evil this time around. Second thing he does, the nation. God chooses this guy, Abram, through whom he will build, quote, let me see if I wrote down where the quotes are from. Abraham, the very first time we meet Abraham in Scripture in Genesis chapter 12, The very first thing God says to Abraham when he chooses him, this is our introduction to the character. God tells Abraham, "In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So immediately, right from the start. And this is where the Jews in Jesus' time had really made a mistake in thinking that their Jewish nation was some sort of an end in itself. And as Jesus points out to them, and as Paul points out to them in Romans and elsewhere, the Jews never really had any excuse for thinking that the Jewish nation was an end in itself. They are told repeatedly, they are told immediately at the beginning, as soon as God calls Abram, the whole earth will be blessed by you. So although the Jews are God's special people who he is working through, it is always evident that the goal of God through the Jews is to benefit everyone. Exodus 19:6, God says to the Jews, "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests." What is a priest? Intermediary. A priest stands between God and man and connects them. Time is up and I'm at the end. So, yeah.
Hey, Josh, I was thinking that evil is actually an apologetic for the existence of God.
Yes, it is.
And okay, because evil exists. We can all agree on that. Evil exists. God can do something about evil. God will do something about evil. So God can and will do something about evil. It requires faith to believe in that syllogism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ryan points out very correctly that the fact that we all have a sense of evil, all know exists, but evil, the idea doesn't make sense. There can't be evil unless there is a God whom evil opposes. And we can go down that a lot, but we're out of time, sadly, but that is a very good point. So we'll leave it there. So God sends the flood, clean slate. God calls Abram, and through Abram, God is going to build a nation of priests, as God puts it, that is going to, well, we'll see what they do next time. Thank you.
Can I just
Oh.
something out there? We all know this, but it hasn't been said. This is not cause and effect. God did not look down from heaven and say, "Uh-oh, there's this big downward spiral of sin. What do? I didn't see that coming." No, God knew before he created anything. Here's what's going to happen. Here's people are going to make bad choices, and it's going to get out of hand. I'm going to send a flood. And then when things get out of hand again, I'm going to raise up Abraham, and through his seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. I just don't want us to get the idea that this is a chronological thing where God says, "Oops, didn't see that coming."
It's God's eternal plan. Good to reiterate.
It has been said, I just got here late, I apologize.
No, it's fine. Never hurts to repeat.
In our most recent reading here,